Did you know that there's a National Shipping Advisory Committee created by the Federal Maritime Commission to advise the FMC on, you guessed it, national shipping issues? They've been in existence for about 6 months now, and they already have recommendations for the FMC. This is a collection of private importers and exporters tasked with reviewing the ocean freight delivery system. And yes, they have some thoughts. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into today's discussion, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. Story number 1, the FMC's extended comment filing period is only open for 1 more day, April 16th. That's tomorrow. As of this morning, there are 52 comments filed. The commenters include the American Association of Port Authorities, the National Retail Federation, American Chemistry Council, National Milk Producers Federation, and the U.S. Dairy Export Council, Toy Association, Transportation Intermediaries Association, the California Trucking Association, and the Harbor Trucking Association, and the National Association for Waterfront Employees, as well as a whole bunch of individuals and private companies. So as a reminder, this was the FMC's Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This was reviewing detention and demurrage billing practices. Again, this is an advance notice. So in this stage, this is the stage where the agency is truly asking for feedback. In this instance, the FMC was asking how people felt about detention and demurrage and the billing practices associated with them. So specifically, as a little recap, the FMC was looking at 3 different things. 1, the scope. Should the final rule include NVOCCs and MTOs in addition to VOCCs? 2, minimum billing information. Should the FMC require minimum billing information for detention and demurrage invoicing, requiring billing periods, what periods they're being billed for, requiring a breakdown of the charges and how the charges are calculated? And 3, billing practices. Should the FMC require billing invoice timelines? Should the FMC require an invoice be generated and sent within 60 days of the occurrence? You know, from some of the comments, some people were actually saying shorter, maybe 30 days was a more common timeline that they were requesting. And, you know, some others said longer, citing that they do their own internal review before sending the invoice to try to avoid the inaccurate invoicing. So what happens now? The FMC reviews the submitted comments and will begin understanding what everyone was saying. Is there a general consensus on 30 days for invoicing, for example? Was there a really good reason to not have the 30 days despite a general consensus, 30 days or whatever a general consensus might be? Then after the input has been digested, the attorneys will go to work and start drafting the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So again, this stage is the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. The next stage will be the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This will be another round of comments, but this will actually have rule text associated with it, likely if this is the next step. The FMC will present what the rule is proposed to look like based on the feedback and based on the agency's intention with the rule. So what were they thinking when they first decided to venture into regulating D&D billing practices, detention and demurrage billing practices? And what did they find out from all these comments from the ANPRM stage? They'll also address, you know, if they do depart from any of the general consensus, why they did that, or why they kept the general consensus from the ANPRM stage. The ball is still in the hands of the FMC, but they obviously will be relying heavily on a lot of the comments filed. So I don't expect this next step anytime soon. I think the earliest would be, 60 days from now at least. I think there's some desire to keep this moving quickly, but they also have to digest the comments received. I'll keep an eye out and let you know when I see movement on this. Stay tuned on my LinkedIn page. If you want more information on the rulemaking, what it is, how to file, you got 1 more day left, or how to check the other comments that are being filed, check out my previous video from February or my LinkedIn post on this. Both of these are going to be linked in the show notes. or reach out directly to me through my legal consulting company, Squall Strategies, if you have a specific question that pertains to your instance. I wanted to take a moment here, though, and suggest that you take a look at the AAPA's, the American Association of Port Authorities, comments. They make a really important distinction in their comments. I quote, "It is imperative that this Honorable Commission understand that neither the freight rate explosion nor the surcharges from carriers are the same as," and they add emphasis here, "fluidity incentive charges." So they continue, "Terminal demurrage has not and should not be the target of customer and policy concerns. These fluidity charges provide the impetus for ports and MTOs to move cargo and sustain efficient freight operations. They are useful and powerful tools for maintaining systemic fluidity and incentives." So a couple things to highlight. They're calling these fluidity incentive charges, and they're saying that terminal demurrage is different than, and I'll explain this in a minute, than carrier demurrage. Important that they're making this distinction, because I think this is true. For the most part, the ports themselves really haven't been the bad guys. So I'm talking about the ports themselves, the public entities. Sometimes ports are operating ports, like in Boston. They own and operate the port. But sometimes ports are landlord ports, where they own the land but lease out the space to a private terminal. That's partly what the AAPA is saying here, that the public ports that may have the demurrage fee on their schedule or their tariff, it's called a schedule for MTOs and ports, is using that demurrage charge to incentivize the movement of goods off the yard. And the AAPA is calling this the fluidity charge. If you do have instances of ports charging the actual port here inappropriate demurrage charges, let the FMC know. This is what they want to know. They regulate the port schedules when the port actually publishes one, and the FMC has said that demurrage and detention are for the incentivization of cargo movement, full stop. Also, I'd like to direct your attention to another area of the AAPA's discussion under the scope prompt. They do a great job of explaining the billing process of ports and terminals, saying that the port will charge a terminal demurrage fee, like I was mentioning earlier, terminal demurrage fee to incentivize the freight movement, and they charge the carrier as opposed to the BCO, the beneficial cargo owner, because the carriers are the ones that are maintaining the custody and control over that cargo and are in the best position to direct its movement. This is what the AAPA is explaining. So let me say that again. They're saying that the port is charging their demurrage fee, the port's demurrage fee, to incentivize the freight movement, and they're charging it directly to the carrier because that's who's maintaining custody and control over the cargo in that piece of the supply chain movement. And they're saying that they're in the best position to direct that movement at that time because of that custody control. The APA is then distinguishing between terminal demurrage fees, like we're talking about here, and carrier demurrage fees, which are defined by private contract, as they explain. They highlight this as being an important distinction as the FMC is building its regulation of detention and demurrage. Look, there's some good stuff in these comments coming into the FMC for this ANPRM rulemaking. I suggest you go check it out. It's 22-04 is the docket number. You can go to the FMC website, fmc.gov, and go over to the e-reading room. And that's where you type in 22-04 and it'll pop up. And then there's a whole portal where they list out everything. Like I said, it's going to be in the show notes, but I really encourage you to go check it out. There's some good stuff in there. That was only story number 1. Story number 2. The Maritime Professor, that's me, is live, but like really live. The website's up. So check it out, themaritimeprofessor.com, and make sure to sign up for the email list so that you will be alerted to when content is available. It's still being created, but being on the email list will give you exclusive access to promo, discount codes for the courses as they're being released. The Maritime Professor will include both free, high-level information and for-purchase deeper dive content. So I encourage you, sign up for the email list on the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So the Maritime Professor, we talk ship. So story number 3, this was actually something that I just added today. This was really, really interesting. I had a few other stories that I was maybe going to add as my number 3 here today, but this one really caught my eye. Earlier today, Chris Jolly of #TheFreightCoach and the armchair attorney, Matthew Leffler, both great friends of this show, were on the Freight Coach Morning Show earlier today and discussed a post that the American Trucking Association made on March 25th. The title of the post, "Many cite driver turnover rates, but few understand what they measure." So in this post, they mention the ATA, the American Trucking Association, mentions a recent New York Times essay that highlights the 91% turnover rate. But this is where the interesting and important distinction comes from the ATA. I mean, we've all heard the 91% turnover rate. The ATA mentions that 91% turnover rate does not mean that 91% of drivers walked out the door. Let me say that again. Just because it's a turnover rate does not mean that it's a turnover of the industry. They're saying that, and I quote, if 91% of truck drivers were quitting the industry within a year, our economy would have collapsed a long time ago. Imagine that. If 91% of truck drivers quitting the industry within a year, that is the current number, and left trucking entirely, the economy would have collapsed. Fair point by the ATA in this post. Also from the ATA post here, and I quote, turnover is not an indicator of people exiting the industry. We know because ATA created and tabulated the metric. Rather, it more accurately measures drivers moving between carriers. It captures churn within the industry, not attrition from the industry. Interesting distinction. I'll continue. While retirements and exits account for a small percentage of turnover, by and large, that is not what the figure is counting. So, further in the post, it continues, and I quote, what does this mean for turnover? Driver A, who's been working for a fleet for only 4 months, knows he can jump to another carrier and get an immediate $15,000 sign-on bonus plus pay raise. 6 months later, he can do the same thing again. This churn, or poaching, or whatever one wants to call it, is what inflates turnover in a tight labor market. Interesting pieces from this post. The article says that the high turnover is an indicator of driver empowerment. They say, and I quote, when the labor market tightens, drivers find themselves in the driver's seat, pardon the pun, putting millions of hardworking men and women in control of their own destiny in ways that haven't been in years, if ever. So this is a really interesting perspective. I'd like to hear your take on it. Are you a trucker? Do you feel empowered these days? And you see the turnover as a way of empowering your ability to call the shots? I'm not sure I entirely buy this, but as the post says at the very beginning, there's a lot of armchair experts these days. Now, I haven't driven a truck myself. I don't have a CDL license, but I do have my captain's license, so I do have the maritime credibility. But I have driven in a commercial truck, and I've worked with truck drivers directly through the years. So maybe that makes me an armchair, but I don't purport to be an expert. I have truck drivers in my family, but the article is right. You know, I really don't purport to be an expert in surface transport, but I do want to help bridge the gap and break down silos between where the freight meets the shores and how it gets to the end user, particularly via trucking. I think one of the biggest things that we all saw throughout this troublesome time of the past 2 years for the supply chain is that there are so many silos, is that we have ocean people and we have surface people. I'd like to bridge that gap. So the biggest thing is to not alienate those who want to be an ally to the industry. There's a remarkable thing happening. People are paying attention to the trucking industry, and not just a few people, mass media, public figures. Heck, even John Oliver did a piece on trucking that I posted on my LinkedIn. Look, keep the conversation going because society is listening, and they won't listen for long, but they want to know how they can help. I'm not sure that I buy that trucker driver retention is an empowering moment, but let's chat. I'd love to hear everyone's reaction on this. Maybe it is. It certainly is a pretty good argument that maybe there's some empowerment by being able to jump around. But on the other hand, you're having people jump around in the industry now. That makes it tough for the actual trucking carrier company. I don't know. I'd like to hear more on this. I thought that it was a really great conversation between Chris Jolly and Matt Leffler this morning. I'm going to be posting and linking to their conversation as well. I think that you should go check that out because they had some really great insights and certainly are service transport experts. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. The Federal Maritime Commission has been really working toward engaging the public in new and effective ways. And one of those ways is by standing up a national advisory committee. So these are federal advisory committees set up under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACAs. Yes, there's an act created by Congress to regulate FACAs, as they're called, Federal Advisory Committee. This advisory committee was even created under congressional authority, this National Shipping Advisory Committee, and is found at 46 USC Chapter 425. So there's actual language created by Congress to create this FACA. So what is it? And who's even on this committee? So the FMC's National Shipping Advisory Committee is made up of 24 members appointed by the Commission, with 12 members representing import cargo to the U.S. using ocean common carriers, and 12 members representing export cargo to the U.S. using ocean common carriers. It's important to note the ocean common carrier piece because that is where the FMC's authority really lies, with the ocean cargo transport side of things. So the members are as follows. On the importer side, we have Brenntag North America, Walmart, Office Depot, Target, MEMA Auto Care Association, Wine and Spirits Shippers Association, Wayfair, IKEA, Gemini Shippers Group, Amazon, Mohawk Global Logistics, and Tractor Supply Company. A lot of really familiar names. On the exporters, we have Louis Dreyfus, CHS Incorporated, Mallory Alexander International Logistics LLC, American Commodity Company, the Schooler Company, Bosco Trading LLC, DuPont, Cargill Incorporated, Ocean Spray Cranberries, a Customs Broker Incorporated, and Tyson Foods. Also some pretty familiar names. So what is the purpose of this National Shipping Advisory Committee? It's actually outlined to advise the FMC on policies relating to the competitiveness, reliability, integrity, and fairness of the international ocean freight delivery system. So being that this is a federal advisory committee, it's required to be publicly available when it's actually in full session. So the first meeting was October 27th, 2021, followed by December 8th, 2021, and March 9th, 2022. They have created subcommittees, which are not subject to the public meeting requirements and are able to be a little bit more nimble in their meetings and discussions. However, any substantive actions or recommendations of those subcommittees are still required to be brought forward to the full committee in public session. So essentially, anything important that this National Advisory Committee does has to be at some point brought before the public. An important piece to this advisory committee. And that point being, you can tune in. A lot of these hearings, while most all of them already, have been live streamed so that you can actually go to the Federal Maritime Commission's website and watch the recording. Or in live time, you can watch the live feed. So what's going on? What happened this week? So this week, the National Shipping Advisory Committee released 2 recommendations to the Commission. That is their purpose. And they are, in 6 short months, delivering on that purpose, making recommendations. So their first recommendation, review of port-imposed or terminal-imposed excess dwell fees as to whether payment of such charges can be extended to the account of the cargo. So in the recommendation text, the group describes the dwell fees they are addressing. And I quote, dwell fees, originally created in October 2021 with input from Port Envoy John Picari, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach announced a container dwell fee designed to incentivize long-dwelling containers to be removed from ocean terminals. This charge was intended to be imposed on ocean carriers. Subsequently, other MTOs announced their version of a dwell fee, which was intended to be for BCOs, beneficial cargo owners. While the LA Long Beach charge has been continuously postponed, citing its effectiveness by threat only, SSA and other MTOs have charges in effect that are currently being assessed prior to container releasing. So the recommendation also references current dwell fees in Long Beach, Oakland, and Seattle. Now I say those are actually current dwell fees because the LA Long Beach dwell fee has been, as the quote suggested, effective in its threat alone. There have been instances of dwell fees going into into effect. So as rationale for addressing this issue, the recommendation says, and I quote, importers do not enjoy a direct relationship with MTOs, ports, imposing these additional fees. Instead, it is the ocean carriers who have that direct customer relationship. Extended dwell is often caused by congestion on terminal, inadequate chassis supply, lack of appointments, closed yard areas, long lines, and lengthy delays for truckers at the gates, or a variety of reasons outside the control of the importer. In such cases, the application of such charges should not be borne by the importer, who cannot be incentivized by the application of these punitive charges to collect the cargo from the terminal any sooner. So essentially what they're saying here is because of all these reasons, they will eventually be passed down this charge that they have no control over incentivizing the movement of that cargo, because as we discussed earlier, for the most part, it still is under the custody of the carrier at that point. So the recommendation of this group is And I quote, "For these reasons, we, as the Unified National Shipper Advisory Committee, hereby recommend that the FMC codify regulation in concert with the interpretive rule, incentivizing the movement of cargo that prohibits any unreasonable application of charges on containers for dwell fees, while shifting the burden of proof to vessel operators and/or marine terminals and strengthening requirements for proper dispute resolution." So there's a few things that they're recommending here. One, they want this to be tagged on to the current ANPRM, the current rule that's being put out by the FMC right now, and also with the interpretive rule that came out last spring, just about a year ago, actually. They're also saying that they want to make sure that the burden of proof for the dwell fees is over to the vessel operators and the MTOs, the marine terminals, instead of on the shippers, because those are the ones that are kind of directly involved in all of this. And furthermore, they'd like to require strengthening of dispute resolution. Now, this is something that's come out of a lot of the FMC's work already, that they would like to see more dispute resolution mechanisms. Maybe that's somebody's email address that you call or contact when something goes wrong with some of these detention and demurrage practices. Currently, there aren't a lot of very clear, visible ways for anyone to be saying that they dispute any of the charges that are coming forward. So that's what they're saying here, is that they would like to also recommend that that be a requirement, that dispute resolution mechanisms, so disputes, resolving disputes, the way that you do that should also be put forth as one of the visibility movements. So here's the breakdown. When the National Shipping Advisory Committee was created, it was right around the time that the West Coast ports, LA and Long Beach, were announcing, and a little hastily, kind of short notice, a new dwell fee that is sometimes called actually hyperdemurrage, because it was such a huge fee. Now, I'm not surprised they addressed it, because I'm not surprised that the National Shipping Advisory Committee addressed this dwell fee, this hyperdemurrage dwell fee, because in their first meeting, this was such a hot topic that it took over almost the entire discussion. So, like I said, their first meeting was in October, and that's when these dwell fees were announced. I think it was actually like a week later that this National Shipping Advisory Committee met. So, of course, this was a hot topic. The dwell fees that were created by LA Long Beach became such a contentious thing and have yet still to be implemented, citing the threats as effective in their goals. They are citing that they have a reduction in their dwelled cargo, the cargo that is stuck around the yards for a very long time. So, I mean, maybe it has achieved those goals. Look, the threat of a fee, particularly one that potentially had regulatory problems in its implementation methods, I don't know, should not be seen as a win when used for action. I think dwell fees don't sit well because of their launch. Dwell fees generally, the actual idea of a dwell fee, I'm not really opposed to. It helps turn over the most stagnant cargo on the yard. Dwell fees basically say you'll be charged higher for stagnant cargo that remains on the yard for too long. As we know, a lot of times, cargo as it comes in is probably temporal, especially for the seasons. They want to get it moving, they want to get it turned over. But sometimes you might have cargo that has a little less of a timeline to it, or because of one of those millions of reasons that were given earlier for why dwell fees are out of the control of the ultimate BCO or the shipper, that might be a reason to kind of work through this a little bit more and really see what's how this can be helped. So I think that the dwell fee generally isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the implementation wasn't done well. So I think that this recommendation is a good one. I think that there should be a little bit more oversight over the dwell fees, maybe a little bit more understanding of what the purpose is and the method and mechanism for implementing them, just to maintain that guardrail over this area. And so I think that, like I said, the National Shipping Advisory Committee is making recommendations, and that's what they were put in place for. So the second recommendation that they came along with, expanding the scope of the FMC to include oversight of rail carriage and related charges for through bills of lading. This one is interesting. Currently, the FMC doesn't really regulate the rail side of things. So the recommendation explains, and I quote, "Many shippers, both importers and exporters, tender cargo to ocean carriers from inland points against rates inclusive of rail and or motor carriage, which are quoted by the ocean carriers and subsequently filed with the FMC. There is currently no adequate dispute resolution process available to shippers when disputes involving the rail portion of cargo movement, including demurrage, rail storage, and detention per diem at rail ramps invariably arise. Let me stop there. So this is one of those moments where the terminology might change, but the actual act itself is the same. So they included demurrage and rail storage to highlight this is kind of the same thing, and detention per diem at rail ramps as kind of being the same thing. So I continue on their quote. More importantly, there is currently no direct governmental oversight over the rail portion of these shipments, nor over their operational execution. So essentially, an extension of regulation over detention and demurrage to rail yards. This seems logical. It may be seen as a mission creep for the FMC, but if nobody is really regulating this area, it's important that somebody does, right? If nobody's really regulating this piece of the rail, but it is so pertinent to and part of the rates that the carriers submit to the FMC, then it stands to reason that this might make some sense. Now, remember, this regulation should be a guardrail to protect against predatory practices. I think that the industry itself is saying we would like some oversight, but I don't think anybody wants the strict oversight. I think that they still want the regulation to be proposed in a guardrail type of method. So this regulation is also proposed to be included in OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which was just passed the Senate. I did a video about it a few weeks ago and is now in full conference for the full final draft to be developed. So the actual recommendation set forth here by the National Shipping Advisory Committee is as follows, and I'm going to quote, "For these reasons, we, as the Unified National Shipping Advisory Committee, hereby recommend that the FMC be given oversight over all carriers, subcontractors, rates, demurrage, detention, storage under any other name, terms and conditions, and modes reflected by any bill of lading issued by an ocean carrier. Additionally, we recommend that the FMC begins mandating the provision of accurate transit, cargo location, and container pickup return locations by carriers to shippers and their nominated forwarders and/or brokers. Finally, in the event of a conflict between the terms of the Unified Intermodal Interchange Access Agreement, the UIIA, and the FMC's Oversight and Interpretive Rule, it is the recommendation of this committee that the terms of the FMC shall prevail." This is a really big recommendation. They're essentially expanding the FMC's purview and regulatory authority. They're saying that in instances of conflict, the FMC should prevail. And they're also extending into new areas that still are logically associated with the movement of that cargo that will eventually see ocean cargo transit. Because, like I said at the outset, the FMC is the regulatory authority over the ocean cargo side of things. Now, it's a little bit nuanced in where that ends when they get to the surface side of things, the internal part. But, I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about this because this is really, as I said, could be perceived to be mission creep. This could be the FMC expanding into areas that maybe it's beyond the scope. We've talked about it before. Less than 120 people work for the FMC. So if this is going to be an expansion of their regulatory authority, they are going to need the support of financial support and full-time employees to be taking on this extension. However, the FMC is the industry expert agency on this matter. They already regulate this world. They have made a point to really dive into this world. And I think it makes some sense. This is all very interesting. This is an importers, exporters group, this National Shipping Advisory Committee, brought together to help guide federal decisions and policy. And here, they're asking for more oversight. They're asking for a mission extension of the FMC's authority. Honestly, I would have probably expected it to go the other way. But to me, that says the group sees detention and demurrage as so bad, so inappropriately assessed that there needs to be more eyes on the problem. Look, this is great. This was the whole purpose of this group, to identify the problems they see and come up with solutions and propose them to the FMC for their consideration. Obviously, any mission extension is going to have to go up to Congress, but this is a great first step. They were tasked with discussing amongst themselves for importers and exporters and, with the public watching in and trying to decide and really pinpoint the pain points that are in the industry. So the next meeting is set for April 27th. This group will be in person at the FMC, and you're welcome to join as the public, but it's also going to be live streamed with a link provided on the FMC's website. I'm really interested to watch this panel because I think we will hear some really great rationales for these recommendations and hear a little bit more about the discussions and examples that went into their creation. Federal advisory committees are a great way to insert real-world experience into federal agency ideas. It's a gut check, a lifeline to the industry. I'm so encouraged to see the National Shipping Advisory Committee take an active role in their responsibility here, and I'm really excited to see what else they come up with. 6 short months and they came up with these 2 recommendations, one that would expand the FMC's authority. They're onto some great things. There's been some talk of having more national shipping advisory committees that'll expand into maybe a ports membership or different areas that they might expand into different membership areas. I think those would also be really helpful, really interesting. Anytime that you're connecting the actual industry to the regulating authority of that industry is always going to be a great synergy, always going to be a great connection. I think that all agencies are well served by having some insight into and some eyeballs really into the industry that they are regulating. So, questions about any of this? Contact me at Squall Strategies. Again, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney and do so if you'd like to contact me through Squall Strategies. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you missed any previous videos, these videos live on my YouTube page by Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out our new website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.